How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. It's lovely to chat with you this annual anniversary.
Yeah, it's very good to see you, Tracy. I think last year I didn't see you last year. It was the year before that I saw you last, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but anyway, so I'm sure you've been creating lots of interesting stories since we last had a conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
So during the pandemic, are you still based in Australia?
Yes, I am. I'm back in Brisbane. We've just gone into a lockdown 5 or 6 days ago. I think it's probably going to be extended. I mean, our problems, we don't have nowhere near the level of infections you do in the UK, but we have a much lower level of vaccination. So while I think we've only got 18% vaccinated, so we need to be very careful. So
Yeah.
it's strange times, strange times. I'm so looking forward to this being something in the past, and we could talk about,
Well,
it being in the past.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, you see, this is the thing about stories. It's like there are so many stories that we're not even aware of. It's only
Yes.
the pandemic occurred that I first found out that 100 years ago there was a similar pandemic.
Yeah.
First World War, and that killed millions of people around the world. And people used to wear masks, and I'd never seen pictures of people in London going around wearing masks 100 years ago. I thought that was a more recent phenomenon, but so there are stories that we are ignorant of, and they only come to light when we have a reason for bringing them to light, I suppose. Or they're with stories. There is like, well, what are the stories that we elevate, that we advocate, and what are the stories that we marginalize and we put to the side? So
That's a good point.
yeah,
That's a good point.
what is your take on the stories that you've grown up with? Which stories have influenced you to become who you are, from childhood, do you think?
Yes, I've got so many things buzzing through my head, just picking up on your conversation there about COVID, Jez, but finding stories to help us make sense of this situation. For many of us, it's unique. We hadn't, as you said, we hadn't heard the stories before, and we look at some frame of reference to help us understand where we are, to give us hope that we will get on the other side of it. And even you just saying that, it happened 100 years ago, it was devastating, and then it finished. That's a story that many will hang on to when they're feeling very low, because that's obviously an impact of this current pandemic. I'm sorry, that was the first part of your question that got me thinking. The second part.
It wiped out, like I know in India, because a lot of Indian soldiers fought in the First World War with the British and supporting the British. And when they went back home, villages were wiped out with this
Wow.
flu. It was a similar pandemic. And so across the world, millions, I think the figure is about 5 or 6 million. I might be wrong about that, but it's definitely millions. Yes.
Yeah.
That were, and I think so, 100 years on, we have so much more technology, we've advanced medically, and still we don't seem to be very well prepared for it.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that no country in the world saw this coming. It's like, well, why didn't we see this coming? It happened 100 years ago. Why weren't we prepared for it?
Yeah, and it's interesting. And so we have television, which is our window onto the world. And I remember 18 months ago watching what was happening in Wuhan and how dramatically the authority figures were in terms of locking people in buildings and capturing them with fishing nets. And I remember thinking, this is surreal. This will never happen here. That's outside my experience. And of course, we didn't quite have that level of containment. But here in Australia, we've got this story where we're being told to stay inside, only to go out for absolutely bare essentials. And so there are remnants of that, and it feels very, very strange.
I think I saw a headline just last night or today saying that in Australia, grandparents are being told to stay away from their grandchildren.
I know. That's right. That's absolutely the case. Absolutely the case, because they're the most vulnerable. It's heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking.
So in terms of our identities, then it's like who, I saw those viral videos going around about people being caught in fishing nets, you know. You probably saw something similar.
Yeah,
And that didn't kind of fit with our identities. It's like, well, that could
absolutely.
happen to us, you know. And then, like, maybe 20 years down the line, people will think, were grandparents really being told not to talk to their grandchildren and stay away from them?
Absolutely, you're right. Absolutely, you're right. Goodness,
So,
I hadn't. That's why these conversations and talking about stories are so powerful. You're tapping into things I hadn't reflected on, and
yeah. So Australia is like a great culture of storytellers, isn't it? You know, so that's my impression of, you know, that.
Yeah, particularly the Indigenous. I mean, the Indigenous Australians who were here thousands and thousands of years before us, they passed down. That was their culture of telling stories, in words and pictures, sometimes through song, as a way of sharing their history and passing it down. And that really appeals to me. And I guess it's because of my own history of having been told stories as a child, and then taking you to a different place. And just, I don't know, there's something in your mind that resonates, and it's anything that's told through a story, you have a much better capacity to remember what happened, how you felt, and what the learning was than through a PowerPoint presentation with 15 PowerPoints.
Yes, and so traditionally there was a culture of telling stories.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of 100 years, perhaps, you know, we've become more, there's been a shift towards, rather than telling stories, we read stories. So that itself has created a big shift, hasn't it? It's like children, they get,
Yeah.
you know, you read a bedtime story rather than tell them a story about your own history. Because when I was a child, my uncle and my mother, they used to tell me stories about our history. They didn't read stories of, you know, Goldilocks and you know, Snow White and whatever. So these were stories that were purely relevant to my life rather than you know, some of them were fabricated stories. They were myths and legends, but nevertheless they were told rather than read. So
interesting. And how do you think it affected your identity and your sense of who you are?
I think that in being told those stories, I got more of a sense of who I am, because this was like when I was in the Punjab, and then when I came to England, the focus there was like very much on reading stories, and I didn't often see myself in the stories. The stories seemed to be, you know, I remember having this set of like Ladybird books. They were the classics, and I couldn't actually see myself in those stories. And I suppose we need to be seen in the stories that we
absolutely. Absolutely. But it's interesting in terms of books, there is a shift back to listening. And, you know, Google tells us, I went to a presentation from a Google employee saying how videos are becoming a much more used way of communicating. And that's, I guess, people telling and communicating in a visual way. I love books, but I choose when I am going to read it, when I'm going to listen to it. And more often than not, if it's a memoir, I choose, and particularly if the author has read it, because it's so much more of a personal experience to hear the person telling the story who owns the story. So so I think we are shifting. And so it's interesting you were saying that you were told stories. I think that with the internet, we are getting more stories told in a visual format through video and other sort of visual channels.
The thing is that when it's recorded, even if it's a video, it's recorded, it can't be changed. Whereas when the story is told live, the tone in which it's told,
absolutely,
the words may change, so it can be malleable, it can be adapted.
Whereas
set in stone, once it's recorded, even if it's a conversation, this conversation, once it's recorded, it's set in stone, it can't be changed. We can't kind of go back and change what we said. Whereas if we retell the story, every time we retell it, it will be slightly different, won't it?
I suspect. And just getting back to your story, which I'm quite intrigued by, Jasvir, your parents or your grandparents, when they were reading to you, I wonder if they changed the ending or your involvement in the story as you got a bit older, and that your context and experience was different. So that's a question to you.
Yeah, yeah. I think, it was always like the stories that I was told, they were always relevant to what I had been doing. And, so I suppose there was an educational element in the stories. Like I was being told, the thing about stories is that they are to be interpreted. And instead of the teaching being directly addressing my behavior, a story would be told. And in that story, we find the meaning that is most relevant to us. So
Yeah.
it's a way of like distancing yourself from the
Yeah.
direct kind of manipulation of behavior. But in a way, stories can manipulate our behavior, can't they?
Oh, absolutely they can. Absolutely. Yeah.
So when you were growing up, which stories do you feel like, looking back, which stories kind of molded and shaped your behavior?
Well, when I was very young, I loved adventure stories, children banding together, going off and solving crimes and discovering new places. And I still remember them. They still inspire me. And I guess that's the power of any story, an opportunity to take you to a different place and to be the hero. Particularly important if you're feeling stuck wherever you are and you can't solve your problem. You get a chance to be in a really safe world and to experiment with a role where you can be the hero and can solve the problem, or can find the criminal, solve the crime, and so forth.
So,
And it's interesting. I'm quite sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, in terms of identifying with the characters in those stories, did you identify with the protagonist? Did you identify with, the person who was a victim? I'm sure you didn't, but that can also be the power of stories. Like, who is it in that story that we
Yes.
identify most with?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And on reflection, which is what you're encouraging me to do, it was always the tomboy. So the girl who was just sort of a little bit more aggressive and doing what the boys were doing. So I guess from an early age, I was spotting that I didn't perhaps want to do the girly things. I wanted to go off and stroll through the rivers and do the stuff that got dirty, and climbing trees and being adventurous.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I suppose that, like in the past, traditionally, there were stories that were particularly, women were expected, girls were expected
Yeah.
to like Cinderella stories, for example.
Yeah, you're right.
Prince, waiting for the prince to come along and sweep them off their feet. And
Yeah. It's probably not till I'm older that I really challenged them. I mean, I never really bought into it because I couldn't really relate to it, because I didn't know too many princes and princesses. But gee, when you think back, a lot of them were just full of nonsense, weren't they?
yeah, the stories of Sinbad and Yasmin, and it's like, the boys would
Yeah.
be expected to identify more with Sinbad rather than with
Yeah.
for example, so
Yeah.
it's the same as with toys, like there are some toys that are naturally associated, or they tend to be associated with
Yeah.
girls, and it's the same with stories. There are stories that are, people think that they will appeal more to young girls, and
Yeah.
appeal more to boys. But in terms of I know, like, you've written books, and the stories that you've read or the stories that you've written about, how do they interrelate with each other?
Okay, that's a good question. So last year I wrote a book of change stories. I myself, I'd been overseas. I'd been in France, and I came back, and there were a lot of short-term change management jobs. And having worked in a change management role, I've been doing it for a few years, and I was wondering, what on earth could these roles be doing that were doing things from just a very short period of service? So I set out to talk to a whole lot of people about their experience in driving change in organizations. And I said to them specifically, I want you to tell me the stories. I want you to tell me the stories that were successful and what you learned from them, and the stories that weren't successful, and what were the signs that things were going astray. And I learned such a lot from that process, which was my original objective. And I think I came up with a very interesting book that's very, very practical. It gives people very motivated to ensure their program is successful some key learning tips on things that they need to put in place. And I think it also reassures you that failure is quite a likely outcome. And here are some things that are signs that it's beginning to go off the rails, and some things that you can do, and to accept that there's going to be some change stories that will never have a happy ending. So that's one project I did last year, which was specifically around stories. I also use it in my consulting work. Sometimes when organizations have a lot of change and you hear the words around transformational change, there's this huge vision that seems so large and complex and unattainable. And what I like to do with the client, being the client organization, is to work with the senior managers and say, let's not spend too long dwelling on all the problems that we're facing now. Let's imagine it's 3 years, we're telling the story of how we were successful, and tell it warts and all. Say, these are the challenges that were faced. This is how we overcame it. And this is what we learned from it. And just that process of reflection and of writing a success story helps them to change their story, and also builds engagement among those who participate in the process.
Yeah, I think what I love about your approach in terms of creating these stories is that then it's no longer a linear process. When it's linear, it's like, well, we did X and we got Y as the outcome. It's like, well, what about all those other variables that you've totally ignored, the complexity of it? So the story enables you to identify patterns through looking at the complex interrelationships, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's like when you're sort of climbing a mountain, you think you've got to a peak and you get to the top and you realize you've still got more to go, and to recognize that, as you said, it's not linear. Mm-hmm. And to talk about that in advance so that people don't feel like they've failed.
And also with the story is that we can see that everything relates to everything else, that nothing happens in isolation. Like when you're talking about change management, well, somebody has been let go of, somebody has lost their job, or somebody's been recruited. Well, that changes the whole story, doesn't it? It has an impact.
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And so if somebody has been dismissed from their work, like even though they're no longer there, their absence still has an impact, doesn't it?
Yeah. The things you can't see, absolutely. And the thing about stories as well is the stories that are in people's heads, we can't see those either. And we also can't see when the stories are changing. So, I know we were having a pre-chat about this presentation, and I was thinking about what are the mysterious things. It's those things you can't see. It's when people are making those links.
Yes.
And so what's good to give them an opportunity to talk it through or to video, or so to help them to make sense of it, and so you can see what's going on inside.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of research that's been done on what you've just said about how so we can see what we can see that which is visible, but we can't see what's there in the unconscious.
Yeah, absolutely.
The boundaries of our own thoughts, we're not aware of it. So what they have that Johari window, don't they, of like the
absolutely. I like that. Yeah, things we know, things we know we don't know,
and things we don't know we don't know.
Exactly. What's the other one? Oh, that visible to you and visible to others. That's right. So things you know about yourself that you know about yourself, and things that other people know about you. Yeah, that's a really powerful tool.
And so it's about kind of stepping into that space. And I suppose in a way, when we're having a conversation, sometimes that is the creativity that emerges from the conversation, is when some thought arises that was not, we weren't thinking about it, or we couldn't have thought about it unless we were in conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And we can't see all that, and all that sort of this mysterious, I guess, incubation process that's going on in the person's head. And it just needs time, but it needs time. And so, as a facilitator of any sort of process, you need to recognize that.
The thing is, you see that with ordinary conversations, we very often we don't allow that space of silence. We feel that we need to say something. As soon as the other person has stopped speaking, we feel that we need to say something, especially in the Western culture. I don't think it's true in all cultures, but cultures that I've experienced, I know that when I'm in the Punjab, for example, very often it's okay to just sit together and not say a word. Whereas I know, like, if I was doing that with English friends, that would seem really strange, to be and saying nothing.
Possibly also, that would happen in Australia, also North America as well. I think we're
yes,
got to move on, got to be doing something, just when you're sitting and reflecting, it looks like no work is happening, and that's because it's all happening inside.
And sometimes we can be communicating even though we're not actually saying anything, we're still communicating. And you being in Australia, like with the Indigenous cultures of Australia, there's, as you said earlier, there's a lot of storytelling. And with that kind of storytelling, how does the story of the Western stories and the Indigenous stories, how do they fit together? Because we all have our own personal stories, we have our social stories, we co-construct. And so how have you been able to have those stories sitting side by side and being interrelated?
That's such a good question, and I'm embarrassed and humbled. I don't know the answer to that. I think my first reaction would be not very well, and I'm embarrassed to say. I mean, I studied Indigenous culture as part of my my A-level equivalent, and I didn't speak to any Aboriginal people, and it wasn't really taught in our schools. And I have very few Aboriginal contacts, but they're not in my friendship group, so I wouldn't pretend to understand the culture. And of course, they're not a homogenous culture. They're all different tribes, and one has to. It needs to be explored. It needs to be explored. I mean, sorry, all these things are going into my head. I'm feeling shame. I'm feeling embarrassment. We need to understand the people, the First Nations, much more effectively, and understand why our two cultures really haven't so smoothly integrated, because they haven't. After 200 years, they haven't.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is interesting. Again, it's like going into that space of the unknown. It's like, so that's an area of exploration, because I know with being born in the Punjab, I know with the colonization it was different, because our stories did merge, our stories did merge, and we have different versions of reality, but we can see the other's point of view. And I suppose maybe that's one of the reasons why our cultures strengthened each other. I think there was I think that the Indian culture has strengthened the British culture and vice versa. It's like both cultures in India, both cultures remained intact. The British who lived there, they didn't give up their culture. They didn't become, they didn't give up their religions or their ways of life and whatever. And neither did the Indians who were being colonized. Their culture remained intact. And I've often wondered why, how in some countries colonization didn't erode the culture, and in other countries it did. I
hope you're speaking to some people who are, that's such an interesting area. That's some people who've done some more research in that important focus.
Because I think maybe we're at a stage in our life now that we have the privilege to be able to explore this and to look at the stories that we don't know, because those stories may further strengthen our own cultures.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of your own professional life then, how, I know you've talked about how you used stories for the change management program and you've written about these, but on a daily basis then, how do you use this concept of that our stories are empowering us or disempowering us. If, you know, like stories can also disempower us, can't, if we identify with being victims, or, you know, or like the villains are just overpowering us all the time. How we position ourselves in the stories that we tell ourselves will change our behavior and our outcomes, won't it?
Yeah. So in response to your question, so you know I write business books on creativity and change management, but I also write fiction under a pen name. And I love writing fiction because it gives you a chance to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And sometimes I'm writing a story and I'm writing from three people's perspectives. And I get a chance literally to put on their shoes and to imagine their experience and how they're feeling. And it gives you a safe space to experiment with different scenarios and different outcomes. And I love it, and I find it very empowering. You know, although characters are creative, but they're all influenced by my experiences. And so things I've seen or not being comfortable with, I put them in the story and I play with how that could have had a different ending.
Mm-hmm. I've heard so many people saying that they wrote a story and it just transformed them. Like maybe the story was cathartic, it allowed them to, you know, whatever it was that was painful or disturbing, or even sometimes it doesn't always have to be pain. It can be something that they're really proud of, and they put that into the story, and it becomes, I don't know, it transforms them in some way.
It forces that process of reflection. If I force is a very strong word, but that's probably appropriate. I actually encourage, I do a lot of small business mentoring as well, and I encourage nearly every person I speak to keep a diary, either get out your phone and tell your story, because your story is unique to you, and it'll be invaluable as a reflection journal, and hey, it may even be the story of your success in a few years' time. So I inspire them and I encourage them to be their own coach, to be their own mentor.
Writing their own stories. And do you do that in your own life? I know you encourage others to journal and to write, and you write books yourself, but do you on a daily basis write your own story and feel that you're creating your own story as you're doing this?
I have lots of multiple. I don't have one storybook. I have many. And so I keep the journals, and then even today I was going back, I'm trying to learn more about this marketing through social media, and it's so overwhelming. And so I put down a job, this is what I want to learn, and this is what I'm having trouble with. And just that process itself, I guess it's using a bit of the Johari window. It forces out the stuff that I don't know. And just saying, this is what I don't know, is actually terribly empowering, and your mind starts working on it. And through synchronicity, somehow then I find that information, well, synchronicity and Google, and I'm able to move forward. So, And I love journals, and I've had many journals over the years. I mean, I do most of my notes into the computer, but I have traditionally handwritten things down.
Yeah, there's that story that we are conscious of, and there's a story that we're consciously creating, and there's that unconscious. You know, there's probably thousands of stories in our unconscious that we're not even aware of, and when we ask a question, it's as though those stories that are in our unconscious are responding to our conscious questions.
It's funny, years ago I created a folder in on my computer, My Fantastic Future. And just saying it was just the most exciting thing. And I still look at it, so I keep bits and pieces to do with things, my ambitions and so forth. And it was like, who am I to claim a fantastic future? And it's like, who am I not to do that?
Okay. Yeah, that's a story in itself, isn't it? You know, who am I not? Who am I not? That in itself is just such a powerful trigger, I suppose, for drawing other thoughts. So in terms of the mystery then, what is your kind of way of, like, how do you envisage exploring this mystery of creativity in stories and culture?
Wow. Well, it's a mindset of being open open all the time, open to learning wherever you are, because there are so many ways we can learn and we can change our perspective. So just being open to that experience wherever you are. It's about taking a step in the direction of whatever it is you want to learn or to solve. And then once you start, recognise the power of synchronicity, the power of Google, and for the knowledge to come to you. And recognise when it's coming, and have those kind of reflection moments, just like I just did then about my fantastic folder, my fantastic future folder. But yeah, it takes this incubation. We talked about that earlier. I think that's important. You start, and you be open to where that knowledge can come from, and it probably will come from the most surprising places. I always find that I get a solution to one problem or situation, always when I'm doing something else. It's like your mind needs to be somewhere else to get a new perspective, and staying, sometimes you take a break from what you're doing to give your mind a chance to make sense of it unconsciously, quietly, and in those moments when you're just sitting and apparently doing nothing.
But earlier on, you said like not every story has a happy ending, and I think that the thing with stories is that again we tend to think of them as being, we can think of a story as being a linear entity, like with a beginning and end, and stories are evolving all the time, and they're cyclical. And I think that's something about the Indigenous Australian cultures, is that they and the Native American cultures as well, that they tend to value the cyclical nature of life, that every story is both an end and a beginning. It's like every ending is a beginning, and every beginning.
I like that. Yeah, I like that. I don't know if you're going to write up, all these conversations you're having, Jessie. You must be getting so many insights and so many stories. Are you going to write that up somewhere?
Well, the thing is, you see, that this is the 5th year now that we've having these conferences, and so there's you being a researcher like myself, like that's just loads and loads and loads of data, loads of data. So it's 5 years worth of data, and I suppose maybe in 10 years time, 15 years time, what we're saying now will become even more valuable in retrospect. It's like, it's like that was something that the idea kind of arose, but we didn't realize how important that idea was at that time. And you look back at it and you think that's a significant idea. But as you said earlier, like the location, the timing, everything has to be, I think, for creativity to be valuable, the time and the place and the context needs to be appropriate.
Yeah. Completely agree.
So my kind of aim is to keep on having the conversations, because again, it's to do with you can't just have one idea, you have to have thousands of ideas, thousands and thousands of ideas, and we do, and it's just that we don't pick up on the value of all of them. And so it's about generating that learning, creating that space, and in that space the seeds that will bear fruit, without us making very much effort. I think that's that's very, when you talk about synchronicity, with synchronicity, it's like many numerous complex variables come together to create that point of synchronicity where very minimal effort is required, and like that is a good seed because it will grow on its own. An idea has wings, they say,
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, well, brilliant, Tracy. So I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and
me too.
We will have many more, I'm sure.
Yeah, have a great day, Jessie. Lovely chat.
Bye-bye. Yeah, bye.